This is slide 3 of our World War II unit, America's Hand is Forced. We will start this one by talking about the Lend-Lease Act. This is a way that Roosevelt could do everything he could short of actually getting into the war and fighting to help the Allies. We were going to lend and get back at the end of the war, or lease at very cheap rates whatever the Allies needed in the war. So whether it be weapons or ammunition or food or supplies or medicine, whatever they needed. We were going to lend them. Let's say if it's a battleship, we'll get our battleship back at the end of the war. Or we could lease it to them for very cheap rates. But down here at the bottom, you see the big map there. This is the flow of Lend-Lease. The thicker the line, the more aid went. So all of it comes out of the United States. But you see there, most of it goes directly to Great Britain here, or to British colonies. So North Africa or Australia over here, India there. So Britain is getting the most, directly to them or to their colonies. Some goes to the Soviet Union, our allies, a little bit to China over here, but Britain gets the most of it. Okay. So it's our way of, it's Roosevelt's way of doing everything he could short of actually being in the war fighting. Okay. Now, the world is shocked when the Soviet Union invades, or sorry, let's back up. When Germany invades the Soviet Union. They had a non-aggression pact signed, and while neither of them trusted the other one, I don't think anybody thought that Germany would actually invade the Soviet Union, but they do. In June of 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union and attacks Stalin. Okay. Now, there are 4 places that we need to talk about in terms of an invasion, and we'll work our way north to south. Okay? So if you look at the map here, we're talking about this area right here of the Soviet Union. Okay? The first place is Leningrad on the north coast, just about, actually, where this little arrow comes down here. North coast of the Soviet Union is a city called Leningrad. It's a huge port city, and most of their supplies that they got came in through Leningrad. The Germans realized this, so they blockade the city. They lay siege to the city. And basically laying siege to a city means that you surround it and cut it off. Nothing gets in or out of the city for 900 days. That's close to 3 years. So for close to 3 years, the city of Leningrad was surrounded. People starved to death in the city. Disease broke out in the city. They ran out of room to bury bodies in the city. So many people were dying. But the Soviets refused to give it up. The Germans never did take it. They couldn't afford the men. They had battles going on everywhere else. They couldn't afford a battle there. They just figured eventually the Soviets would give up, and they never do. Okay? So the Soviets will hold Leningrad, and the Germans never do get it. All right, next, working our way south toward the middle of the country there, is Moscow, the capital. And really, this is just a matter of 2 armies duking it out. The Soviet Red Army fights valiantly, very bravely, to stand up to the German attack. The Germans make it to within 50 miles of Moscow. Make it to within 50 miles of Moscow. It's a huge battle. That's closer than Louisville to Lexington. That's how far they are. Literally, in the distance, they can see the tops of buildings over the horizon there, just on the horizon. They can see the tops of buildings on the outskirts of the city. So, in suburbs. So the Red Army fights very valiantly, but really what stops the Germans is the winter. It is an especially brutal winter in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets are used to fighting in this. They have uniforms for it, they have vehicles for it, they have weapons for it. The Germans are not used to this kind of winter. And they have no idea how to fight in it. Their machinery, their vehicles freeze up, their guns freeze up, they don't have warm enough uniforms. So while the Red Army fights very bravely, the Soviet winter really is what does in the Germans at Moscow. Okay. The next one, work our way south, is Stalingrad. And this is in the southern part of the country, down near the Black Sea. And Stalingrad is a huge urban area. Stalingrad is the largest example we see of urban fighting in the war. Street to street, building to building, hand to hand combat in Stalingrad. And really, the reason that the Soviets are so desperate to defend it, and the Germans are desperate to get it, is that Stalingrad is the gate to huge oil fields in the south of the Soviet Union. And both sides desperately need the oil to continue their fighting. So Stalingrad is protecting the oil fields. Okay. And lastly, just south of Stalingrad, we see a town called Kursk. And Kursk is the largest example of tank battle that we see in the war. Over 6,000 tanks are involved in the Battle of Kursk. Just over 2 million men. So this is an incredibly large battle. Largest tank battle in history, and we'll never see a bigger tank battle ever. That's just not how warfare is done anymore, with tanks, blasting away at each other on a battlefield. And the interesting part about all four of these battles is that the Soviets win all of them. Okay, so the Russian winter will doom much of the German advance into the Soviet Union, and all four of these battles will be won by the Soviet Union. Okay. All right, in August 1941, we see a meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This is our first mention of Churchill. There you see Franklin Roosevelt on the left, Winston Churchill on the right. They would become very good friends throughout the war here, respect each other greatly. They meet on board a ship, a battleship, off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. And while this is called the Atlantic Conference, their meeting, the document they produce is called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter will look greatly like Woodrow Wilson's 14 points from World War I. This is sort of the plan for what the world is going to look like at the end of the war. Who's going to control what, where lines will be drawn, and so forth. This is the plan for the end of the war, called the Atlantic Charter, negotiated by Roosevelt and Churchill. Now, let's turn our attention for the first time to Asia. We've not talked about that. We will as the war goes on here. Japan is a small, tiny little island nation that is greatly dependent on other countries for natural resources because they don't have enough. They don't have a lot. They don't have near enough of what they need. Much of what they've been getting from the United States. But as Japan continues to grow more and more bold and take over and invade more and more countries, the United States and Franklin Roosevelt decide they are going to cut off the flow of resources to Japan. We are going to slap an embargo on Japan. So no more steel, no more tin, no more oil. All of the resources they've been getting from us, we're cutting them off. They're either going to have to stop invading these other countries or find another source of resources. Well, Japan realizes there really isn't another source of resources. So they make a bold decision. If they can't find what they need elsewhere, they are going to get it from the United States. And they realize that the only realistic chance they have of defeating the United States in a war was to take out the bulk of the United States fleet at the very beginning. So they launch a surprise attack on the United States naval fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor is the main Pacific base for the United States Navy. It is where most of their Navy is based in the Pacific. And Japan is going to plan to take out the bulk of that Navy in one decisive battle at the beginning of the war. If they can do that, they can force the United States to sue for peace. So they plan a daring raid. Their plan is to deliver a declaration of war to the United States government in Washington, D.C., and several hours later, attack at Pearl Harbor before we can do anything about it. However, there's a huge however here. There is a delay in getting the war declaration translated into English and delivered to the Secretary of War in Washington. They postpone their meeting, but nobody informs the military. They don't postpone their attack. So what ends up happening is they end up attacking the United States before formally declaring war on the United States. A huge misstep here. Militarily speaking, it is a brilliantly planned and conducted exercise. They sail several thousand miles across the Pacific undetected and launch a surprise attack against the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor. About 3,000 people were killed in the attack. 19 ships were sunk. Every U.S. battleship that we had in the Pacific was either sunk or heavily damaged. Militarily speaking, this is a brilliant attack. Unfortunately for the Japanese, and fortunately for the Americans, we get very lucky. The main target of the Japanese planes that attack Pearl Harbor are the aircraft carriers, the United States aircraft carriers. All of the aircraft carriers happen to be out at sea when the attack is launched. Had the aircraft carriers been at Pearl Harbor, they certainly would have been the target of the attacks. They would have been sunk or damaged, and without aircraft carriers in the Pacific, the United States would not have been able to fight off Japan. This would have been a very different war if the aircraft carriers had been there. As it was, damage was bad enough, but it wasn't fatal. We were able to regroup and fight back.